Hello, dear friends. Welcome. My name is Kirsten DeMelo, and here today we have my dear friend, Julio Padovan. Thank you, Julio.
Thank you.
Today we're going to be just giving some comments, or making some comments rather, on the book, The Psychology of Gratitude, that was psychographed by Givaldo Franco by the spirit Joanna De Angelis. Julie, there's so much we could comment about from this book. I mean, you could spend probably years, possibly decades or more, to give it justice for the content that's so rich. But one of the things that caught my eye, and I really wanted to discuss this and develop this with you, and if you allow me, I wanted to read this little part. And for those of you who wanted to follow along, it's on page 63 of the book. I'm just going to go ahead and read it. And Joanna says the following: "There have never been more styles of amusement or techniques for recreation, not to mention amenities for relationships, fraternity, and integration among people. Still, this expected scenario is not what is observed in the earthly society, where loneliness, anxiety, and fear dominate in pandemic proportions. The infirmities which are the results of somatizations of psychological perturbations abate countless victims to which they fall prey, defenseless in their constraining webs. The number of behavioral disorders, cardiovascular diseases, and types of cancer is appalling, to name only a few of the most frightening disturbances." And I'm going to jump a couple of paragraphs to page 64, and she ends with something. "In this turmoil, the family has been destroyed, the domestic communion has been uprooted, the collective shadow has taken control of the home sanctuary, and disintegration has substituted for union." This has so much relevance in what's going on today. I mean, if you open up the DSM, or if you look at recent research about the pandemic we have with anxiety, with mental health, behavioral health issues, not just in this country, but in other countries, but it just seems like it truly is a pandemic. More and more people are being diagnosed. And Joanna's bringing us quite an interesting perspective. And I kind of wanted to get your feedback on this, not just because you just so happen to be the one who translated this along with the help of others, but perhaps you have a little bit closer relationship with the book. So what is your take on that when you read that and you hear her words, that there's never been more styles of amusement or techniques for recreation?
Okay. So, Kirsten, the first thing I would say is that for anyone that wants to actually study Joanna De Angelis, is to take it easy and go very slowly. Her books are extraordinarily dense, very rich in terms of information, in terms of content. And it's very important that we, like you just said, you just read a small excerpt from a chapter.
Yes.
And actually it's an excerpt from a part of a chapter. So we can see how much we can use of it, a very small portion of the text to start discussing. And this discussion, like you said, can take actually quite a lot of time.
Yes.
So in this particular case, Joanna De Angelis is showing us a dichotomous behavior in our society today. When we look at everything that we have accomplished as human race, as human beings, what we see is that we have perfected as much as we could, and we continue to do so. So the word perfected here is kind of strange. We have developed it as much as we could, actually, socialization skills and also activities that would actually bring us more towards this socialization. We are, after all, social animals or socializing animals. And yet, the way we use these very techniques that should be used, that are there to bring us close together, the way we use them is actually to drive us apart. So it's the quest for the extremes. And it's very interesting that today, with all that we have amassed in terms of knowledge, in terms of information, that we are still very much caught in this turmoil of associating ourselves with extremes of behavior. So for instance, she starts by saying that we have now a lot of technological advances that should bring us close together, and yet we use that exactly to move away from those that are around us. Sometimes even inside a family, in the family nucleus, you see individuals isolating themselves and using technology to do so. But we have to remember that it's not the technology that is doing that. The technology is the means, is the tool. How we use it will actually lead us to one consequence or another. So we have to look at ourselves and see, why is it that we are using whatever is available to us? And right now, at this moment, it's technology. 100 years ago was something different. 1,000 years ago, something even completely different than what we have today. Today, it's technology. So why is it that we are using these things to drive us to extremes of isolation? Extremes of isolation that Joanna Giangeli later on elaborates further and explains that it creates anxieties and everything, all the psychological disorders that eventually have an end in suicide in its most complex situation.
So do you, from your understanding, so it's not the cell phone's fault. It's not the iPad's fault. It's not, the television that's 4K. It's not all of these things that our kids or that we own, have, or purchase. It's not that in and of itself, but it is the ways in which we utilize that medium that affects our lives. So what you're saying is that, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, they had their own means to separate themselves from the family. So what perhaps we could say that it's not the physical thing itself, but perhaps as families and as individuals and as partners and couples, what we need to really be looking at is the dynamics of our relationships.
That's correct.
Because it would appear as though, from what Joanna is saying, is she's saying that the family, which the family is a unit, it is the cell of society, is being broken down. Right?
Yes, and one thing that's important for us to understand here, when she says family, Joanna Giangelis is not exactly mentioning the traditional family, man, woman, so husband, wife, and kids. Joanna Giangelis is calling family any nucleus of association where individuals live together a long period of their lifetimes. This is what she's mentioning here as family. So it's very important.
No, that's really good to know, because nowadays modern families are quite different, and people do cohabitate in many different. So that's good that you mentioned that. But for the sake of this conversation, family can be so many things. But the people in which we associate ourselves with and are committed to in a relationship, it's important that we look at that. We would say, Joanna's saying, it's important that we look at our dynamics as a family. So
that's correct.
If she's saying that the collective shadow is taking control of the home sanctuary and disintegration has substituted for union. So when she talks about the shadow, we're a little bit familiar with it in terms of Carl Gustav Jung, when he refers to the shadow as all that is in the unconscious, kind of like Freud's, well, not Freud rather, but when we look at the picture of the iceberg, the tip is our consciousness and everything below the iceberg is the unconscious. We also would call that the shadow. So all that is what really drives us. The shadow or the unconscious mind is what drives us most of the time. And she's saying that that is what's taking over. Now, can the shadows take over anyway, independent of what we're doing? So it's not just the cell phone. It's not just, our children or our loved one being preoccupied. It could be anything. So can you elaborate that a little bit more? I know you have a little bit of experience with that understanding of what the shadow is and how that can sort of play a role in our lives in sort of overtaking. Perhaps it's past tendencies that we're not fully aware of, or our fears, or hidden things, because the shadow is all that which is hidden, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I'll try to address it as much as I can. Well, the first thing is we constantly ask ourselves, why is technology doing this to us? And I do not believe, I still believe it's a complex situation, a complex scenario. But I do not believe that this is the correct answer, question to ask. I think a better one would be, why is it that we are allowing technology to do this to us? Or even better, because technology is not an entity, it's not a being, we should say, why is it that we are using technology to do so, to separate us, to isolate us? So when we talk about shadows, it's actually a very sore point for most individuals. And perhaps this is a point where Spiritism can help us by educating us. Because a shadow, or the atavisms, the inheritance that we bring from our past reincarnation processes, right? We have a tendency to say, well, I am what I am today because I did this, this, and that in the past, as if that alone were an excuse. So the person even somewhat acknowledges the shadow or the atavism or the, the past inheritances, but doesn't do anything about it. This is actually not a healthy way of dealing with it. In the same way that it's not healthy to see all that and then create guilt and allow yourself to stall your progress because you just say, well, I did all this in a past life or in any past life, and now I have to go through all the difficulties I'm going through right now. Or, no, I do not deserve to be happy. That is not the issue here. The issue is we have a past. We have the atavisms. We have the shadows. We need to acknowledge them, and we need to work right now and do everything that is within our capabilities to remove them from ourselves. What people do is that they flee from them. And in this process, they use any tool as escape mechanism, escape coping mechanism, as it's called in psychology, which is basically a flight from the problem. You're fleeing from the problem. And in doing so, nowadays, we use technology.
So in theory, based upon this, and in the book Existential Conflict, she talks about the psychological escape. So in theory, from what she says, we don't need a cell phone to escape from our reality of our day-to-day life. We can be physically together as a family, but people, their minds could be elsewhere. Their feelings could be elsewhere for whatever reason. So it's interesting that it goes back to this idea you're sharing, that we're not asking the right questions. We're not looking at it from the correct perspective. We're sort of simplifying an issue that's much more complex, that we need to stop and really ask us, why are we utilizing these things to escape? What's really laying beneath the surface? And what are we really afraid of? And one of the things I have learned through just beginning to learn more about Joanna and a little bit about psychology, and also listening to an audiobook by Dale Carnegie that talks about how not to worry, how to live your life without worrying so much. And one of the things that he touches on is this idea. He tells a story about a professor that in the first day of class, the professor brings all the students to a sink. And the students are looking at him, and he has a glass full of milk. And those big, and if you've ever been to a big college, they have those big, steel sinks. So the professor proceeds to knock the glass full of milk into the sink. It shatters. The milk goes everywhere. He turns to his students, and he says just this: don't worry about spilled milk. It's spilled. It's done. Move on.
It's over.
It's over. Can you do anything? Can you put the glass back together? Maybe, if you're insane and want to spend the next 24 to 72 hours piecing each one together, but it'll never be as it was. Forget about it. Move on. And many of his students later, who a few of them were interviewed, had said that was the most impactful experience, that they took that to not worry about the things that have already happened, that they have done, to not feel guilt, to not keep looking back and saying, man, I wish I didn't do that. Man, I wish I didn't do this or that. Because that's what's really lying beneath the surface, right? Because we're so stuck on surface level. So when we say, put away your electronics, put away all that which is technology, and let's go, a lot of people say, oh, I wish we could go back to basics. I wish we could go back and live in a straw house. But that's not going to fix things.
That's the other side. That's the other extreme.
That's the extreme, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's trying to cover up one extreme, because it's a cover up, it's a patch, it's like a band-aid. It's a cover up of one extreme with another. It's like exchanging 6 for half a dozen. It
Yeah.
will not change. You're just changing the circumstances, but the problem still lies there and it's still this one and the same.
Exactly.
We need to figure out that we need to accept also that we are very complex and also rich beings, and that things don't have simple solutions like that. Oh, if I put my cell phone aside. Oh, if I put my game aside. Oh, if I put my computer. It's not just that. What am I doing that I actually flee to these devices? What is it that I am doing that makes me abhor the possibility of talking to someone face to face or interacting in a group? And we need to understand that all that we are doing here is evolving, is our evolution, is development of our personalities. And that requires us to have an identity, which she discusses also in other books. For instance, the human being, the integral human being, right? And she also discussed a little bit in the psychology of gratitude. We need to preserve and build this identity. When we flee from situations of socialization, we are not strengthening our individuality, that personality, that identity. What we are doing in this moral, in this fight, which is a moral fight, and that we're fleeing from it, is that we are actually weakening it. We are weakening our identity, because the only way to strengthen it, the only way to actually develop it, is by allowing it to clash with other identities, with other personalities, with other ideas that will enrich us even further. But if we don't have that, we stall our progress. We are actually stalled if we are not interacting. The virtualization, the virtual world, is important. It's a tool, it's a technological tool that we need to use nowadays. But it cannot provide the unknown, the unexpected, which another human being can provide, which a social group can provide. Even if we were able to program random acts, we could still say that within a certain range of parameters, we could expect this or that. But with an individual or with a social group, we can never say such a thing. It is a lot more, it's a lot richer, a lot more encompassing, more challenging to us. That is why we can have the technology, we can use the technology, but not use it in the extreme. We also need to focus inwardly, to look at ourselves, see that we are these rich, complex beings, and that we need socialization.
You know, Julia, listening to you and sort of thinking about it, it seems in some way, the way that our society has developed, even our work environments, the way that businesses are set up, universities and so forth and so on, it seems as though it's really negatively impacting the family as a whole. Now, you talk about, there's nothing that can replace socialization, being amongst people, but ultimately, we learn with our families, right? Whatever whatever ways in which our family dynamic is made up, but we learn from one another. But if we think about, okay, what would be the ideal? The ideal would be that there wouldn't be extreme. We wouldn't need to escape into our whatever form of technology. We would have a time for a time to be together, whether it's a family activity, but also we would have time for ourselves, because as individuals, we need to make time for ourselves. Self-love, which is often misconstrued. Some people misunderstand it, or they have a wrong idea about it because they think, well,
right.
You're being so egotistical, you're being selfish. It's often confused with, oh, you're such a selfish person. No, we need to find time for ourselves. We need to find time for our family. We need to find time for our community to work together because that's also really important. And it would appear as if we were made for socializations and to socialize. We're social beings. I mean, everything from the atom to the human level, everything is a relationship with one another. You know, the electrons having a relationship with one another. My relationship I have with my mortgage company, we're constantly immersed in relationships, right? So we cannot interactions.
Exactly.
And somehow working on how to interact appropriately in a positive way, to make things so where I'm happy and you're happy and we're just working a happy society. But it would appear in a way, though, if we observe the ways in which businesses work, and people obviously who work wherever they may work, whether it's for a business, whether for an insurance company, or it's for a hospital, it would appear as if we're overworked sometimes, and by the time we get home, we're tired. It would appear as if there's this external force working against the family unit, wishing to divide and conquer. I mean, are there ways we can sort of avoid that? I mean, obviously, we all have to work. We all need to make a living. It's just the nature of the beast, as they say. But shouldn't there be a better way to go about it? Or should we be really making a huge effort to really set aside time for family in whatever way, whether it's family walk, a family activity, we're all going to go play this game together. Would that help to combat some of the issues that are arising? As Joanna says, there's never been more styles of amusement, techniques of recreation. And I wanted to touch on that and here just in a second, but I wanted to get your feedback on the issue. It sort of seems like it's a paradox that we are social beings, we need to be together, but yet we're not finding the appropriate time for the family unit itself, and it's breaking down.
Okay. As I mentioned before, this is a complex scenario. It's a complex problem, and the solution has to match the problem. Now, the solution does not have to be convoluted. People confuse convoluted with complex. But if the problem is complex, the solution can be simple, but without having to meander, without having to be convoluted. That's what it, but it still has to be a solution that is appropriate to the problem. We need to understand that if you watch, for instance, a predator, a carnivore, attacking a herd, the carnivore, the predator, is not going to attack the whole herd. It only wants one animal, because there is the instinct of survival. Basically, there is hunger, and that hunger has to be placated. So what the carnivores normally do is that they isolate a member from that herd, and some of them will isolate the lame, the weak, the young, or they would just isolate one, because they have that instinct has been developed throughout eons, and they understand with this that by isolating that isolated animal is not as powerful as when that animal is in the herd, is in the group. So today, without going particularly into politics or economics or this or that, anything, whatever it is that's out there that attacks the familial nucleus is doing exactly what this predator is doing. By isolating by isolating the members of a family, and remember here, family in its most ample context here. By isolating the members of the family, we weaken each one of them, and they become easier prey. So we have to be very careful. Then, now we have to look from the other side of the problem, the side of the prey. So we've just said what the predators do to weaken us. Now, if we are the ones now being weakened, if we are the ones now being isolated, segregated, separated, what is it that we are doing to prevent that? So we need to be careful with how we behave with our lives. Why is it that today, with so much information that we have, why is it that we are still behaving more instinctively than anything else? Most of what we do nowadays is a reaction, not an action. We do not stop 1 second to think before we act. So it's always a reaction. It's an instinctive behavior that we will never lose. Everything that we have learned from the atom, as you put very well, Everything we learned when we were monads and we evolved into spirits, that we learned from the atom through all the unicellular organisms, pluricellular organisms, everything to get to this point, the human stage, we will keep with us, and we'll take that with us in the continuation of our evolution. But that doesn't mean that that particular type of behavior should be the predominant one. The instinctive behavior was important when we're animals. In the human stage, it should be reasoning, it should be intelligence, it should be the exercise of our free will, not instinctive behavior. And yet we are still reacting basically, which is acting instinctively. So for instance, you said about someone trying to make a living, right? And of course, we all have to. And it's actually the law, it's part of the law of progress, it's part of the law of work. We have to do so. It is important so that we can have the merit for our accomplishments. But how much of it, how much of the energy, of the effort, of the input that goes into this making a living is actually for our necessities, and how much is it for excesses? Because we live the consumerism, but the consumerism did not exist before us. We created it. It was our actions that led to the word. The action itself, the phenomena, did not exist before human beings. We created it. So if we created it, our actions have led to it, which means that we are still going for more than we actually need.
That's interesting.
And each person has to stop and think where to draw the line. It's not possible for us to decide a line that is going to be the same for everybody. Every person will have different needs, will meet different needs, and after that will be excesses. When we do that, how much time could we actually save that we could be using now to interact with our kids, with our spouses, with our companions, with our friends, even the colleagues at work? Right?
No, absolutely. It's interesting that you say that, because it seems like it's just this vicious cycle that we, like a feedback loop, that we realize that we like something, exterior, a physical, material. It could be anything from, clothing or taking lavish vacations. So we say, well, in order for me to afford that, I have to work more. So, and then I have to keep working more. And then not that there's anything wrong with, taking a trip, a family trip. We're not saying that. I don't believe that's what she's saying. Because even so, in the book Existential Conflict, she says in the first chapter, I believe it's entitled Psychological Escape, she says it is important for us to find time to retract a little bit, meditate, so we're not constantly, in the thick of it all the time. We are allowed to step out of that for a while, but everything's balance,
Exactly.
Everything has to have, equal amounts, otherwise one's outweighing the other. But it would appear that it's some sort of a feedback mechanism that, I like this, I want to go after, so I have to work more, and then it affects my family breaks down, and then I spend more money on this and that, and it just seems like it's a never-ending thing. And I did want to touch on this idea that, as a sidebar, there is nothing wrong with amusement or techniques for recreation.
No, in fact, Emmanuel says that in 2 or 3 of his books, with these words, that rest and recreation are sacred. He doesn't put the two together in the text. I'm saying, but every time he says rest and recreation, he uses the words sacred. And as part of that, it's part of our development. We need to know the balance, and we are not only entitled, but in some ways it's almost mandatory that we should have rest, that we should have recreation.
Yes, I believe it's even stated in the Spirit's book, something to the same effect.
Exactly.
And we do. I mean, some might pull out the argument, well, the physical body needs rest. Indeed, but this is the vehicle that we are using. And if we don't, it's like a car. If we don't take your car for its yearly maintenance, for the oil, to treat it well, it'll break down on you. And when you need to go somewhere, you may want to go, but the car is not going to go with you. It's simply not going to work out for you. But so we know that it's not wrong, and in fact, we should find time, but everything would appear to be balanced.
So we need to understand that our brain, the physical control center of our physical bodies, right, has been wired through millions and millions of years of evolution to avoid situations that produce negative feedback, and actually to seek out those conditions that produce rewarding opportunities for us. So everything, including technology, can be addicted. As addicted as any drug, as addicted as any substance, chemical substance, biological substance. So we have a tendency to let ourselves, to relinquish ourselves, to let ourselves go, to give ourselves to these things. But now, here's the part that we have to stop and reflect a little bit. We say to ourselves, oh, I'm a human being. Well, if we are a human being, why is it that we are still acting like an animal with instinctive behavior? So we need to learn to train ourselves to analyze our lives, to analyze every moment in our lives. This is not second-guessing ourselves. This is not trying to analyze, will I eat this or that for breakfast, and then spend an hour on that. It's not this extreme. But, for instance, the most important things that we do in our lives. And even after the fact, when we have said something, we have done something, we have thought something, later on, perhaps when we go to bed at night, spend 5 or 10 minutes re-evaluating everything that we've done during that day. And if we figure out that we haven't behaved in the best way possible, have not had the best thoughts possible, not feel guilty about them. Not feel guilty about anything we've done or said, but the next day, do better. This analysis does not include Jimmy, our neighbor, only ourselves. So I have to compare myself of now to myself of a minute ago, an hour ago, a day ago, a year, a decade, and so on. I am the only person that can judge myself because I know my background. I know what I'm capable of, and I know what I'm not capable of. So when I do not do something, I am the only person that can truly say, I have omitted myself from doing that because I know that I had the power. It was within my grasp, within my means to do so, and I actually didn't do anything. Or I can say, no, I didn't do it because I didn't know better. I didn't know how to go about that problem. So we have a tendency to always look over the fence, and of course the grass is always greener on the other side.
Yes.
And when it's not, then our envy, our pride, everything that is, let's say, less constructive in us comes into play and then tries to put that individual down or that situation down so that we can elevate ourselves by comparison. We have to break this habit. To break this habit is to start acting less instinctively and act more in a more intelligent way, in a more reasonable way, using our free will, the exercise of our free will, and our reasoning to do so. Until we do something like this, we are not condemned, but we are condemning ourselves to repeat our mistakes, to isolate ourselves, to weaken ourselves. And we have many tools that can assist us. We spiritists have spiritism, which is a tool that allows us to look inside ourselves, to learn actually how to do so. And we have to use it. Being a spiritist is not saying, I go to the Spiritist Center. Being a spiritist is not saying, oh, I give to charity. This is not spiritism. This is not even self-knowledge. Being a spiritist is actually using this tool, this wonderful tool that we have, like others have in religion or in philosophical beliefs, that others have, to look inside of ourselves and then implement changes. This implementation is what will separate us from those shadows of the past. The shadows are experiences of the past we judged to be failures. As we detach ourselves from them, they will continue to exist. They're not going to go away. They will be part of us because they were our experiences. But what we will do, we will see them from a different context, from a different point of view, and we will no longer see them as failures. And in doing so, they will move from shadows to simple experiences. Much more constructive approach to the same thing.
Joanna says something, not just in The Psychology of Gratitude, but in other books in various different ways, when she talks about how important it is for us to be aware of our shadows, to acknowledge them, because that which, she doesn't say this specifically, I'm just sort of adding this, but that which we bring to light ceases to be a shadow, because what is a shadow? How is a shadow made? I mean, in an actual physical sense, you cast a light over something and it creates a shadow. But if you when you put the light on the actual shadow, the shadow disappears. Is a shadow, I mean, metaphorically, is a shadow always there? Sure, it is. It is always there. But when you put light on it, when you bring light to it, it ceases to be this scary thing. One of the things that came to mind as you were speaking, it reminded me of something that Kardec says in the Spirits book, one of the observations, when he talks about our morality and our weaknesses. And really, we can't rid ourselves. There's not a way for us to sort of get a pair of scissors, cut it like this, and just take it out. But what he says, what we can do is to work on our morality to make that instinctive or the animal side or those bad tendencies that we have to speak less loud, and to make our moral part speak louder. So again, it's sort of a mechanism to make you raise one up and the other one gets smaller and smaller and speaks in a smaller voice, and the other one speaks more louder. So really, in terms of practicality, in terms of day-to-day, how can we utilize this? I've often thought about Spiritism in the same way that you just mentioned it, like this, in this context, that when we read books like these, when we read the Spiritist literature, when we read the codification, it's beautiful. The books of Emmanuel, Andrea Louise, it's beautiful. And if you see that bookcase there, it seems beautiful. It's full of colorful books. But I've always viewed it as this. It's kind of like having a painting from Monet hanging on your wall. It's analogous to when you read all these books, you study everything, you go to your Spiritist center, you do all these things, but you don't really apply it. You don't use it in all the littlest, smallest areas of our lives. It's like a Monet painting. It's beautiful to look at. But in reality, it doesn't make me a better person to own a Monet.
Correct.
I can own every single piece of Spiritist literature or spiritual literature, but if I don't take this into my heart and really have it find its applicability. If you open up the Gospel according to Spiritism, a lot of people, myself included for many years, would skip over this very first part of the book, the introductions, the preface or the preface, and I would say to myself, who needs that part? Let's just jump to the good stuff and go to chapter 1.
Right.
But we need to utilize all of it. But in the beginning of the Gospel, it says something to the effect of, the applicability. We have to see how it is applicable in our lives. Take it and say, okay, you know what? And not say, chapter 1. Oh, Jimmy needs to do this. Jimmy, our neighbor. No, say how, okay. She says, the acquisition of conscience constitutes a great existential challenge to human beings, How can I utilize this in my life? What can I do to change? And something I love that Joanna says, that once we begin to work on ourselves, we begin to develop this compassion for other people, because we begin to realize how difficult, how challenging, how much time it takes to really modify our behaviors, our emotions, how we feel, and how we react, and how we act around people or to people and to ourselves. We begin to have more compassion for Jimmy, the Jimmys of the world, because we realize, you know what? This isn't the easiest thing in the world, but I know I can do it. So it's important that we spend time reflecting and we get out of this behavior, as you were saying, of constantly acting out of instinct. This consumerism, consuming to consume, because on TV, and we see children like this, if you, on the weekends, especially Saturday mornings, you see there's a slew of commercials with toys. And even from my personal experience, I remember not letting my daughter watch TV and really playing DVDs for her, because I found that during that time period, the commercials would pop on, and then every commercial, she'd say, I need that, I need that. So it's this consumerism that we're made to believe since we're a child, that you need this to be happy because we see smiling children. But in reality, that the physical things don't make us happy. These amusements, although good, aren't the end all to be all. They're there for our distraction for a small fraction of our lives, but ultimately we come back again to ourselves, to our family setting.
They
right?
are creating new shadows.
They're creating new shadows.
Which will be atavisms in our next and
There you
future
go.
reincarnation processes.
That touches on when the sinner comes to Jesus and he tells him, go and sin no more.
Yes.
We would say in modern terms, go and stop making more shadows, right?
Exactly.
Right?
In some ways.
Work with what you have. Could we even say, Julio, that perhaps we should watch a little less TV, a little less allowing ourselves to be exposed to all these things that could be impacting us, even on an unconscious level, and sort of spend a little bit more time going inside, observing, maybe starting a journal, to even observe ourselves?
Well, I think it's difficult to create a formula because every person is different. For instance, if we were to say here, you have to watch less TV. Americans watch, this is a statistical value, so an average of 6 hours of TV a day. So of course there will be those who watch no TV at all, may not even have a TV set. There will be those who watch 12 hours. This is the average. Mm-hmm. So you divide the number of hours watched by the population number, right? So, but if I say that, the person, for instance, that watches half an hour, 1 hour in a week may feel, oh my goodness, perhaps I am watching too much. And I might create guilt where none.
No guilt needs to be felt.
Exactly. None should be found. So I wouldn't say that. I think what we have to be careful is the consumerism. When we say consumerism, I don't necessarily mean the purchase of material goods. For instance, there are spiritists that are avid consumers. They go to the center, they buy every book, every DVD, every media, every possible piece of information, and they read. And then they come to you and say, oh, I've read all the 5 books of the codification in 1 week. They have consumed them. They have not used them, read them, incorporated the examples that are in those books. If you come to a spiritist center, if you visit a spiritist center and tell any person who works there, oh, that has been reading, these individuals have been reading these books their entire lives. They have been reading it for the 5th, the 6th, the 10th time. And then you tell an individual like that, yes, I've read all 5 books of the codification. It's not a question for pity or no. It's a question of just saying, wow, this is consumerism. You're consuming the books. You have convinced yourself that by purchasing or borrowing, it's not the purchase, it's not the material purchase, but by reading them, you can move on to the next. You have consumed and discarded right away for something new. Some individuals said, oh, don't we have another book that's been translated into English? Or don't we have another book, for that matter? I can read in other languages. Well, but how are you reading these things? Right? And in life, it's not just with spiritist books. There are many other very important activities and other books and other media that we need to go over them over and over and over again.
Yes.
Because every time we go through its content, we learn something new because we mature a little bit more. We are psychologically a different individual, so we can look deeper and deeper and read more and more between the lines.
Exactly.
This form of consumerism hurts, and here, because we're talking about spiritism, hurts the spiritist. And that individual might not even realize that. We have to be very careful. It's what you said about the Monet painting. Having it is just a ritual. And a lot of us are reading the books or are doing this or that out of a ritualistic approach, but this individual has not incorporated all the positive aspects that that action can provide. And we have to be very, very careful. When we come to the technological advances, which is what we started this conversation with, it is, as I said, very hard for us to impose a formula to say you're watching too much, so let's drop 10% or 5%. I think what we have to ask ourselves is, am I gaining something from this? Because, for instance, let us say that you watch 2 hours of TV every single day. But during those 2 hours, you watch those 2 hours because you are on the treadmill or you are on a stationary bike, right? And you're watching a documentary or you're watching something about a nature show. So you're learning something. Well, would you say that that is worse than a person that watches only half an hour but watches a program that is degrading, that speaks completely against the family or against society or against positive things in life? Just because of numbers, 2 hours versus half an hour? Of course not. We wouldn't, any sane person wouldn't judge the 2 hours worse than the half an hour in these two examples, simply because of the numbers. So we need to ask ourselves, what am I gaining from this? Is it a documentary? I watch a lot of documentaries, for instance, because I sometimes use them in my classes when I teach, right? So I don't feel I don't have any problems with that. I don't feel guilty that I'm spending time sitting in front of the TV, right? Or someone, for instance, may be putting together a website, but perhaps that individual spends 2 or 3 hours a day adding things to the website. But this is a website, for instance, that helps individuals who have had loved ones that passed away with a particular type of cancer. And that individual is bringing hope or a message of consolation to the other individuals in the same situation that he or she was a few years back. So it's very difficult. We are the only, we go back to that old adage. We are saying, and we keep saying, we are the only ones who can judge that. And we have to ask only one simple question. Am I building a better individual from this? Am I gaining something that is constructive, that is positive, that is allowing my spirit to detach myself from the shadows of my past, from my atavisms, and see and now begin to see them as experiences that made a better me? If I'm doing that, and I am absolutely sure that I am getting something constructive, I'm on the right path.
Yes.
I shouldn't change anything. Now, one person could ask the $1 million question, right? The $1 million question is, how would I know if it's constructive or not? Read books, study. And for us, spiritists, let us read, let us discuss, because with that, we'll have more and more tools to be able to judge ourselves, to be able to judge all these activities we go through in life, and be able to say if they're being constructive for us or just being a waste of time.
And I think we're going to end with that. And I'm just going to add a little bit more to that and just saying it's not what we're doing, but it's why we're doing it, what is our purpose, what is behind it.
Exactly.
And we can end with this quote from William Shakespeare that I've always loved, that it's not, what makes something bad is how we, and I'm paraphrasing him, so forgive me, William, wherever you are in the atmosphere, but how we make something bad is not just saying that it's bad, but we define it. We say if something is wrong or something is right by our intention of why we're doing it, because two people can do the very same thing, but their intentions are very different.
Exactly.
So that makes it not so good, and on the other hand, it can make it really good. So our intention, our reasoning, our purpose, which leads us back again to the inner reflections of how we're living our lives, why we're doing what we're doing. It's not the thing itself that makes it bad, but it's how we view it and why we're doing it. Because like you mentioned about the TV. So I think it warrants us to really just think about why we're doing things in our lives, what is our purpose. And Givaldo has mentioned various times in different lectures that it's important for us to set a goal. What goals
Exactly.
do we have in our lives? What goals have we set for ourselves as individuals? What goals do we have as in our family setting? If it's our goal is to be closer, my goal is to be more understanding of this or that, but we have to have a goal. What are we working towards? So I think that we can end with that thought because we can go on for hours on end, right?
Yeah, I would just say we have to remember that we cannot give this to anybody else. We cannot transfer the responsibility for our evolution. We progress individually. All of us, each and every one of us, we progress individually. To progress, to evolve morally and intellectually, we need to learn. So, but one thing is interesting is that we progress individually, but we learn socially. We learn in a group. So to tie all things together here, right? We need the socialization. We cannot isolate ourselves. And we can transfer as much as we want the blame, assign blame to the technology or to this or that particular tool, but we are the ones doing that to ourselves. Technology did not exist before human beings. We created them. So let us remember that if we want to progress, we want to continue, we have to do that ourselves, separately, individually. This is not an egotistic thought, but to do so, to evolve individually, progress, we need to learn, and we are going to learn socially in a group.
Wonderful. Julio, thank you so much.
Well, thank you
again
for
joining
inviting
us.
me.
And I'm going to end on this. If you haven't ever read this book, I would say I really urge you to read it, to study it for a lifetime. This is not coffee table worthy. This is put it on your shelf, keep it next to your bed, put it on your table to be studied. So we leave you with that, and we wish you many blessings, and God bless. Bye-bye.